Something enormous just shifted in the UK housing market and almost no one is paying attention. Behind the headlines and political noise, new mortgage rules have quietly taken effect. Thousands of landlords are exiting and powerful corporations are quietly buying entire neighbourhoods. The government is floating tax ideas that could reshape property ownership for a generation. And the strange part is that these changes, which seem unrelated on the surface, are all feeding into each other. Whether you rent, own, or are still saving for your first deposit, what's unfolding right now is going to shape your financial reality for years to come. It began with a document most people never read. In March, the Financial Conduct Authority issued guidance that at first glance looked like another bit of bureaucratic language. But what it actually did was loosen some of the toughest borrowing standards in modern British history. Since the 2008 crash, every buyer has been forced to pass strict stress tests before a bank would even consider a mortgage. These weren't just affordability checks. They tested how a borrower would cope if interest rates suddenly jumped by several points. The idea was simple. Make sure people don't buy more than they can handle and prevent a repeat of the financial collapse. For years, that logic made sense. But when rates began falling again in 2025, lenders were still testing borrowers as if a crisis was right around the corner. That's when regulators stepped in. The FCA told lenders they were allowed to use more realistic assumptions about future rates, instead of those punishing reversion levels that had locked out entire groups of potential buyers. They reminded banks that the purpose of consumer protection isn't to exclude people who can actually afford to borrow. It's to make sure the loans they take are fair. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Start approving more people. Within months, another major update arrived. In July, the FCA overhauled the mortgage rulebook, cutting down layers of red tape and streamlining how borrowers could switch products or shorten repayment terms. Refinancing suddenly became easier. You could approach a lender and discuss a deal without triggering the usual avalanche of formal advice requirements. For the first time in years, the system felt as if it was trying to get money flowing again instead of choking it off. And there was more. A long-standing rule that limited how many high loan-to-income mortgages a lender could issue now only applies to institutions writing over £150 million in loans per year. That means dozens of smaller lenders are free to offer 5 or even 6 times income, something that had been virtually impossible for a decade. Combined with a new government-backed guarantee scheme for smaller deposits, it has become significantly easier to borrow large sums again. But that raises an uncomfortable question. Is this really about helping buyers, or is it about keeping prices high? When you make it easier to borrow, demand rises. When demand rises faster than supply, prices climb. Regulators know this, policymakers know this, yet they are encouraging it anyway, because what they fear more than anything else is a housing correction. The irony is that supply is already increasing. Both Rightmove and Zoopla have reported the largest number of homes for sale in more than 10 years. On paper, that should be a dream scenario for buyers. More listings, more competition among sellers, and better deals. But demand is only up a few percentage points, nowhere near enough to match the surge in properties hitting the market. That imbalance is giving buyers new leverage for the first time since before the pandemic, but it's also revealing something deeper. Many people are selling not because they want to, but because they have to. Those who bought during the pandemic, when fixed rates were hovering around 2%, are now facing the end of those deals. Their monthly payments have ballooned by as much as half. Even with the recent relaxation in mortgage rules, tens of thousands simply can't afford to refinance. Instead of defaulting, they're cashing out. Agents across the country are seeing a wave of forced sellers, families who can't sustain the new payments but don't want to lose everything. Homes that would have sparked bidding wars just 2 years ago are sitting for weeks, sometimes months. That rush of new listings is a symptom of stress, not confidence. And the government knows it. Looser lending standards aren't just about supporting first-time buyers. They're a way to keep the market moving, to prevent a chain reaction that could send prices tumbling. Because if the housing market stalls, the entire economy shakes. Home values are tied to consumer spending, retirement saving, and banking stability. A broad decline in property prices doesn't just hurt homeowners, it erodes the foundation of Britain's financial. While regular owners are being squeezed, another group is quietly positioning itself to profit. The renters' reform agenda, designed to strengthen tenant rights, has had an unintended side effect. Small landlords are leaving in droves. Many of them own just 1 or 2 properties and treat their tenants like extended family, often keeping rents steady for years. But new regulations, reduced tax relief, and growing uncertainty are pushing these small owners out. The government's own research backs this up. According to the English Private Landlord Survey, large landlords, those with 5 or more properties, are twice as likely to evict tenants and far more likely to raise rents both between and during tenancies. In contrast, small landlords tend to hold rents steady and work with tenants during hard times. Yet those are the very landlords now disappearing from the market. They're being replaced by bigger players, the ones driven purely by spreadsheets and return on investment metrics. What's emerging is the same pattern that has transformed other industries. Independent cafes replaced by multinational chains, local shops outcompeted by logistics giants, human connection replaced by algorithms. In housing, the same consolidation is happening quietly and it's accelerating fast. Institutional investors, some of the biggest names in global finance, are buying property at scale. BlackRock, Lloyds, Legal & General, Granger, and others now control tens of thousands of homes. They don't just buy individual properties, they purchase entire developments, often before the public even sees them listed. BlackRock has even invested in brick manufacturers, securing influence over the raw materials that build the homes themselves. When you own the supply chain, the construction and the final product, you've turned housing into a vertical monopoly. Why are they doing it? Because housing has become the perfect investment vehicle. Inflation makes rent go up, while debt becomes cheaper in real terms. Unlike tech stocks or volatile commodities, people will always need a place to live. Rent is one of the few payments that almost never stops, no matter what happens in the wider economy. These corporations understand that shelter isn't just a basic need. It's a commodity with nearly inelastic demand. For tenants, that shift changes everything. When your landlord is a person, you can negotiate, delay a payment, or appeal to empathy. When your landlord is a corporation, decisions are made by algorithms. Rent increases are automated, maintenance budgets are optimized, and eviction processes are streamlined. You become a metric on a quarterly earnings report. This isn't the end of buy to let, it's the industrialization of it. And it's leading to a future where most renters deal not with people, but with property funds. The smaller landlords being forced out are handing their assets directly to institutional buyers, consolidating power in fewer, far richer hands. That shift won't just reshape renting, it could redefine what home ownership even means in the UK. And while all this is happening, another debate is quietly simmering inside government offices. Property taxes, already one of the biggest sources of revenue for the Treasury, are being reimagined. Last year, nearly £15 billion came from stamp duty alone, even with lower transaction volume. That success has emboldened policymakers to explore an even bigger prize, a land value tax that could replace both council tax and stamp duty. Leaked discussions suggest such a levy would target properties valued above £500,000. It's being sold as a way to make the system fairer and shift the burden toward wealthier owners. But wealthy in this case often just means owns a modest home in the south of England. In many parts of London and the southeast, even a small flat crosses that threshold. What sounds like a tax on the rich could easily become a recurring bill on middle-class families who bought years ago and have simply watched prices rise beyond their control. Politically, it's clever. Younger generations who can't afford to buy are more supportive of taxing property wealth. Older homeowners, meanwhile, are asset-rich but cash-poor, making them easy targets for a government desperate to raise funds without touching income or VAT. The danger is that this kind of tax doesn't just skim the surface, it can destabilize the entire market. Annual property bills running into thousands could force many owners to sell. As supply floods the market, prices fall. Lower prices drag more people into negative equity, which triggers more sales. Once that feedback loop begins, it's hard to stop. Right now, Britain's housing system is being held together by fragile incentives and quiet policy changes. Looser credit rules keep buyers in the game. Forced sellers feed supply without collapsing prices. Institutional money absorbs the properties that individuals can no longer afford. And looming above it all is the possibility of new taxes that could turn property ownership into a liability rather than a symbol of stability. What we're witnessing isn't just another cycle of boom and bust, it's a structural transformation. Ownership is being replaced with tenancy, small players are giving way to global capital, and a market once defined by aspiration is slowly becoming one defined by dependence. If you're paying attention, you can see how each policy connects to the next. Cheaper borrowing props up demand so the government can avoid a crash. Rising rents make property even more appealing for corporations. A land value tax could drive out remaining independent owners, providing yet another buying opportunity for large funds. It's a self-reinforcing system, one that concentrates housing power into fewer hands each year. For ordinary people, the implications are profound. Buying a home was once a way to secure freedom, a hedge against rising costs, and a path to financial independence. Increasingly, it's becoming something else entirely, a privilege protected by policy and accessible mainly through institutional control. The housing market of 2025 isn't broken by accident, it's being redesigned. The question is whether anyone can stop it before there's nothing left to own at all. Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that overnight the rules have changed. Not because you missed a payment or broke a law, but because the government decided that simply living in your own home now carries a price tag you never agreed to pay. An extra £43,000 a year, every year, just for existing in the house you already own. Not a mortgage payment, and not an improvement cost, a tax that never stops coming as long as you have a roof over your head. It sounds impossible, maybe even absurd, but that's exactly the kind of system being discussed by policymakers right now. One that could transform home ownership across Britain into something entirely different from what it's ever been. For millions of people, this isn't some distant hypothetical. It's a potential financial earthquake hiding behind a few lines of economic jargon. The story began quietly, tucked away in reports from respected outlets like The Times and The Guardian, describing how government officials are exploring what they call a modernized approach to property taxation. But the fine print tells a different story. The proposal would replace two familiar taxes, stamp duty and council tax, with a brand new system that looks simple on paper, but could end up costing ordinary families a fortune. Many of the people who would be hardest hit are not wealthy investors or developers, but everyday homeowners who bought decades ago and now live on modest income. They're people who worked hard, saved carefully, and expected that owning their home would one day mean security. Under this plan, that security could vanish overnight. Here's how the scheme works. At present, you pay stamp duty once when buying a property and council tax every year, based on valuations that haven't been updated since 1991. It's far from perfect, but it's at least predictable. The new plan would throw that entire framework out and replace it with an annual charge based on the property's current market value. In other words, the more your home is worth, the more you pay every year. And the definition of high value is far lower than most people realize. Early figures suggest the tax would begin at around 0.5% annually for homes valued above £500,000, rising to 0.8% for homes above 1 million. The problem is that in today's market, those numbers don't describe luxury mansions. They describe perfectly average family homes across much of London and the southeast. It's easy to think £500,000 sounds like a lot, but property prices in Britain's capital and its commuter belt are wildly inflated. The average London home already costs more than £660,000. That means a huge number of middle-class households, nurses, teachers, civil servants, would suddenly find themselves paying thousands of pounds every single year. Not because they've become richer, but simply because the housing market did what it always does. It went up. And that rise, which once felt like a reward for years of saving, would now be turned against them. Consider what that looks like in real terms. A retired couple who bought their home decades ago for under £200,000 might now see it valued at £700,000 or even £1 million. Their income hasn't changed, it's still their pension, maybe £20,000 a year between them. They own their home outright, they've already paid every tax due on it, and they budgeted carefully for a quiet retirement. Then this new tax lands, demanding a yearly payment larger than their entire income. £43,000 a year on a £6 million property. Even those with smaller homes could see bills in the tens of thousands. The result is simple. They'd have no choice but to sell, even if they never wanted to leave. And it's not just retirees who would struggle. Middle-income households with mortgages would be hit just as hard. Imagine finally saving up for a semi-detached in Greater London, stretching every pound to make the deposit. You're paying thousands a month on the mortgage, and now suddenly you owe thousands more every single year purely because of this new valuation-based levy. Home ownership, long seen as the foundation of financial stability, would become a never-ending burden. It gets worse. Insiders have suggested that the government might also pair this new annual tax with an additional charge when selling your home. So even if you're forced to sell because you can't afford the ongoing payments, you'd still face another heavy bill the moment you complete the sale. You'd be taxed for owning the home and taxed again for trying to escape the very system that pushed you out of it. That's not reform, that's punishment for playing by the rules. Supporters of the plan claim it's about fairness, that people living in valuable homes should contribute more to local services. But that argument ignores the reality that not all homeowners in expensive areas are wealthy. Many are asset-rich but income-poor people whose houses have appreciated beyond reason while their earnings stayed flat or vanished in retirement. They can't spend the value of their home without selling it, and they can't sell without triggering even more tax. It's a trap with no exit. Meanwhile, the ripple effects would distort the housing market itself. Think about properties priced just under the £500,000 mark. No one would want to push past that line because the moment a house sells for £1 more, it enters the taxable bracket. Sellers would underprice to stay under the threshold, while buyers would avoid anything that crosses it. The result would be a bottleneck, with prices artificially frozen below the limit and chaos above it. At the higher end, owners facing the new tax and potential seller's fee would try to inflate prices even more to offset what they'd lose to the government. That means £1 million homes could jump even higher while mid-range properties stagnate. The entire market would warp around political math rather than real supply and demand. And then there's the regional divide. In places like Doncaster, Hull or Sunderland, where average home prices are well under £200,000, hardly anyone would pay this new tax. Meanwhile, homeowners in London, Surrey, Kent and other high-value regions would shoulder nearly all of it. You'd have a system where families in the South fund services across the country, while those in cheaper areas pay almost nothing. Redistribution through the income tax system is one thing. This, however, would be redistribution through geography. It's easy to imagine the resentment it would spark, a north-south divide deeper than any before. There's also the moral issue. For decades, governments of every stripe have encouraged citizens to invest in property. They told people to buy homes, to view ownership as a mark of success and stability, and many took that advice. They sacrificed holidays, luxuries, and free time to pay off their loans, confident that by the time retirement arrived, they'd be secure. Now, with this plan, the same state that urged them to buy is preparing to penalise them for doing exactly that. It's not just financially ruinous, it's a breach of trust. Home is not a stock or a bond. It's where people build their lives, raise their children, and create memories. Treating it as a perpetual revenue stream erases that human reality. Imagine being 75, sitting in the home you've lived in for 40 years, and realising the government now considers you a revenue problem rather than a citizen who's already paid your dues. You're told to downsize, move away, or start paying tens of thousands more every year. even though you did nothing wrong. That's not progress. That's cruelty disguised as policy. If introduced, this tax would also have political consequences that reach far beyond the property market. The proposal, believed to have the backing of senior figures in government, could alienate huge sections of the voting public overnight. Homeowners in their 50s, 60s and 70s, people who vote in large numbers, would be furious. Younger families who've only just managed to buy would feel betrayed. Even lifelong supporters of the ruling party could turn away if they see their home turned into a liability by their own leaders. It's the kind of decision that could define an election, maybe even end a government's tenure altogether. And make no mistake, once a tax like this exists, it rarely goes away. History shows that when governments find a new source of revenue, they cling to it. Rates creep up over time, exceptions vanish, and what begins as a fair contribution turns into a permanent drain. If this property value tax becomes law, it could stay in place for generations, tightening every few years until owning a home feels more like renting from the state. Defenders argue it will create balance by reducing inequality, but the truth is, it would likely make them worse. Wealthy property investors and corporations can shift assets, restructure ownership, and absorb losses. Ordinary homeowners can't. The ones who get crushed are always the people with the least flexibility. Retirees, families, single-income households. The same demographic that followed every rule set before them will be the one punished hardest. And beyond all of this lies a quieter tragedy, the slow dismantling of the British dream of home ownership. For decades, people believed that if they worked hard enough, they could buy a place of their own and live out their days in peace. That dream is what kept countless workers going through recessions, austerity, and endless rent hikes. Turning that dream into a yearly bill strips it of its meaning. It says, you never really own anything, you're just borrowing it, at the government's discretion. The consequences would ripple across society, housing markets would seize up, generational wealth transfers would collapse, local economies would suffer as retirees sell and move away. And yet, in meetings and consultations, the proposal continues to circulate, discussed not as an extreme idea, but as a realistic modernization. If this becomes reality, it won't happen with fanfare. It will slip quietly into a budget statement, wrapped in bureaucratic language about efficiency and reform, but its effects will be anything but quiet. People will open letters one spring morning and discover that everything they've worked for has been reclassified as taxable property wealth. For many, that letter will feel like an eviction notice written in fine print. What can be done? Awareness is the first step. Policies like this thrive on obscurity. They move forward because people don't notice until it's too late. The more homeowners who understand what's being proposed, the harder it becomes to push through unchallenged. Writing to representatives, organising locally, and making noise in public forums are not meaningless gestures. They're often the only things that stop bad ideas from becoming law. Because make no mistake, this proposal isn't a tweak. It's a fundamental shift in how Britain views ownership, fairness and responsibility. It punishes those who planned ahead, destabilises the market, and deepens regional inequality. It's not reform, it's regression, with a modern name. If it goes forward, the consequences will reach far beyond the property market. They'll reach into the core of British life, into the meaning of home itself. Parliament has just voted on one of the most sweeping housing reforms in decades, and the fallout from that vote will reshape how millions of people in the UK rent and manage property. Whether you own one flat, rent with roommates, or are trying to find a student housing for next term, what just happened in Westminster matters more than most people realise. The Renters' Rights Bill was supposed to be a step toward fairness, protection and balance between landlords and tenants. But after last night's vote, many fear the law will do the opposite, tightening supply, pushing rents even higher, and driving good landlords out of the market entirely. The legislation sped through Parliament faster than almost any housing bill in recent memory. Committees flagged problems, economists warned of side effects, landlords and tenant groups alike called for more consultation. Yet the government kept its foot on the gas. By the time the final debate arrived, this was Parliament's last opportunity to make adjustments that could stop the policy from backfiring. They had the evidence, the data, and the testament. They knew what happened when similar rules were tested elsewhere, and they still voted down almost every amendment that could have made the system workable. One of the clearest examples of how out of touch the decision-making has become is the pet deposit rule. MPs were asked to approve a small change that would have let landlords request up to 3 extra weeks' rent as a deposit when tenants move in with pets. It wasn't a requirement, just an option, an incentive that could make it easier for animal owners to find homes while protecting landlords from damage risk. But Parliament struck it down completely. Under the new framework, landlords will no longer be able to advertise no pets, yet they're also forbidden from taking a higher deposit to cover the potential costs. On paper, it looks progressive. In practice, it creates a minefield. Landlords will quietly avoid applications from pet owners. Tenants will waste time applying for properties they'll never get. And the end result is a market that pretends to be inclusive, while actually becoming less so. This same pattern plays out across other parts of the bill. Take student housing. Large houses shared by multiple tenants, HMOs, can still operate on the academic calendar, allowing landlords to reclaim properties each summer to prepare for a new intake. But thousands of student rentals aren't HMOs at all. They're 1 or 2 bed flats rented to pairs or small groups of students. And under this bill, those landlords lose the ability to align their tenancies with the school year. An amendment was proposed to fix that giving them the right to regain possession at the end of each academic cycle. It was rejected too. Now, many smaller landlords will simply stop renting to students. They'll switch to long-term tenants who don't leave every 9 months. The knock-on effects are obvious. Fewer affordable student homes, longer commutes, universities forced to scramble for emergency accommodation. When that shortage hits headlines next summer, MPs will act surprised, even though the warnings were spelled out in black and white. Then there's the 12-month reletting restriction, a clause that borders on absurd. Under the new rule, if a landlord asks a tenant to move out because they plan to sell and the sale later falls through, they can't rent that property again for an entire year. Proposed fix was to reduce that ban to 6 months. Still harsh, but at least survivable. Parliament refused. Imagine owning a flat that's now sitting empty. You're paying the mortgage. The council might charge double tax on empty property. You've lost rent for months and aren't legally allowed to relet the place, even though people nearby are desperate for somewhere to live. That's not consumer protection. It's economic vandalism. The government insists this will stop landlords from pretending to sell just to raise rent, but losing 6 months of income already makes that scam pointless. Instead, the rule punishes legitimate property owners who get caught in slow sales market. The penalty system adds another layer of confusion. Under the bill, local authorities can fine landlords up to £40,000 for breaches, but they don't need criminal level evidence to do it. The standard is now balance of probabilities, meaning someone can lose tens of thousands of pounds based on assumptions rather than proof. That's a civil threshold, not a criminal one, and lawyers have already warned it's open to abuse. The justification given by ministers was that higher standards would make enforcement too difficult. That's basically an admission that the government wants to fine people more easily, even if it means some innocent landlords get caught in the crossfire. What happens next is equally concerning. The Renters' Rights Bill is headed to royal assent, which will make it law. But that doesn't mean everything changes tomorrow. The rollout will be gradual, just like the Leasehold Reform Act that passed over a year ago but still isn't fully enforced. A few easy to implement items, like the shift from fixed term to rolling tenancies, will arrive quickly. Those are simple administrative changes that don't need new infrastructure. But the central piece, abolishing Section 21 no-fault evictions, will be delayed for years, and that's where the system could buckle. Section 21 currently lets landlords regain possession without proving fault. It's what keeps thousands of disputes out of court. Once it's gone, every single eviction must go through a full legal hearing, complete with paperwork, judges, and evidence. Courts already face months-long delays for basic possession cases. Piling thousands of new claims into that system without new judges or staff is a recipe for paralysis. Even government insiders admit the courts aren't ready. Officials will likely announce temporary postponements or phased implementation, citing the need to hire more tribunal staff. Meanwhile, landlords won't know which rules apply. They'll hold back investments or decide to sell altogether rather than risk being trapped in legal limbo. That exodus is already underway. Surveys show record numbers of private landlords selling their properties. High interest rates, loss of mortgage relief, new licensing requirements, and now the Renters' Rights Bill have made small-scale property ownership more trouble than it's worth. And when landlords exit, supply drops. When supply drops and demand stays high, rents rise. It's not ideology, it's arithmetic. Yet Parliament behaved as though basic economics had been suspended. Tenants, ironically, will be hit hardest. The average renter isn't lying awake at night fearing a Section 21 notice. They're worrying about finding any flat at all. The biggest crisis in the rental market right now is scarcity. In many parts of the country, there are 10 applicants for every decent property. The Renters' Rights Bill does nothing to fix that imbalance. If anything, it makes it worse by pushing more property owners out of the sector and discouraging new ones from entering. And then in a few months, headlines will start showing the consequences. Student housing shortages, renters with pets facing blanket rejections, empty properties sitting unused because of the 12-month rule, court delays stretching evictions into year-long ordeals. Each new symptom will be treated as a surprise when, in reality, every one of them was predictable. It's especially frustrating because some amendments were genuinely constructive. There were proposals for stronger enforcement against the small percentage of landlords who neglect repairs or engage in harassment. There were ideas to simplify how tenants can challenge unreasonable rent increases. Those would have improved living standards without damaging the market. But by rejecting targeted fixes and replacing them with blanket restrictions, Parliament chose ideology over practicality. What often gets forgotten in these debates is who most landlords actually are. They're not corporate developers or giant real estate fund. Most own 1 or 2 properties. Maybe they inherited a house and rent it out for extra income. Maybe they bought a flat as a retirement investment. These people aren't sitting on vast portfolios. They're everyday workers trying to balance mortgages, maintenance, and tax, and they're being regulated as if they were a multinational corporation. Each new fine, restriction, or delay makes their position less viable. Some will hold on until their fixed rate mortgage expires, then sell. Others are already listing properties while demand remains strong. The ones who stay will become more selective, choosing only the safest tenants. Anyone with pets, on benefits, or with a non-traditional income will find it even harder to rent. The government's vision seems to be a market where tenants feel secure, but security doesn't come from laws alone, it comes from abundance. When there are enough homes, tenants can choose where to live. When supply tightens, power shifts back to landlords, no matter what the law says. That's the paradox here. A bill designed to empower tenants may end up leaving them with fewer choices and higher costs. This is how slow crises start. First, supply dips slightly, then rents creep up. Then people start sharing smaller spaces or moving farther from city centres. Over time, housing insecurity becomes normal. The Renters' Rights Bill risks accelerating that process by discouraging the very investment that could alleviate it. Instead of making renting simpler, it creates layers of uncertainty, rules that sound fair in theory, but collide with financial and logistical reality in practice. Years from now, when analysts look back at the trajectory of the UK rental market, they'll see this vote as a turning point. The warnings were documented. The economic forecasts were clear. Everyone knew that discouraging landlords during a supply shortage would tighten the squeeze. And still, politics won out over pragmatism. If you own a property, you're probably already running the numbers, asking whether it's worth staying in. If you're a tenant, you're likely bracing for steeper competition and rising rents. And if you're somewhere in the middle, thinking about buying your first rental or relying on one as your pension, this bill has just changed the equation. The consequences won't arrive all at once, but they're already in motion. For years, Britain's housing debate has been trapped in a false binary: protect tenants or support landlords. The truth is, both depend on the same thing: supply. More homes mean more options, more fairness, and more stability. The Renters' Rights Bill ignores that completely. Instead, it treats regulation as a substitute for construction, control as a cure for shortage. And that's why the market is about to get tougher for everyone involved. So as this bill moves toward royal assent and begins its slow rollout, remember what this moment represents. The warnings weren't hypothetical. They were written, debated, and recorded in the very chamber that chose to ignore them. When rents climb and availability drops, when students can't find flats and pet owners are turned away, it won't be a mystery. It will be the inevitable outcome of a law that mistook good intentions for good policy.
Imagine waking up to find that living in your own home could soon mean an annual property tax bill of £43,000. This isn't a distant threat. It's a real proposal for UK homeowners, replacing council tax and stamp duty with a tax pegged to today's soaring house prices. Why is the government ready to risk uprooting retirees and reshaping the entire housing market? The true story of UK homeowners erupt over a £43,000 property tax starts here. For more than 3 decades, the foundation of property taxation in the UK has rested on a system many now consider deeply flawed. Council tax bills are still calculated using property values set all the way back in 1991, a year when the average house price in London was under £100,000. Today, that figure stands above £660,000, yet for millions of homeowners, their tax band remains frozen in time. This disconnect means 2 similar homes, side by side, can face wildly different bills simply because one was revalued or extended after the cut-off, while the other was not. The result is a patchwork of winners and losers, with no relation to current market realities. Stamp duty land tax, introduced in its modern form in 2003, is only paid when a property is bought or sold. Revenue from stamp duty swings wildly with the housing market, leaving local councils and the Treasury guessing how much they will collect year to year. These unpredictable receipts create headaches for public budgets and discourage people from moving, as each transaction triggers a large, one-off payment. Over time, these quirks have combined to produce a system that is not only outdated, but also fundamentally unfair, especially for retirees living on fixed incomes. Calls for reform have grown louder, with think tanks and campaigners pointing to the need for a fairer, more stable approach that reflects the true value of homes in today's market. The proposed property tax for 2025 is designed to replace both council tax and stamp duty with a single annual charge tied directly to the current market value of a home. Under the Treasury's most recent modelling, the core rate would start at 0.5% for properties valued between £500,000 and £1 million. For homes above £1 million, the rate rises to as much as 0.81% per year. Every homeowner would face a minimum bill of around £800, even at the lowest end of the scale. Unlike the old banded system, this tax is strictly proportional. If a property is valued at £600,000, the annual charge would be £3,000 at the 0.5% rate. A home worth £1.5 million would owe £8,100 a year, calculated at the higher rate for value above the £1 million threshold. These rates are not theoretical, they are drawn directly from the Onward think tank's proposals, which have guided Treasury modelling and are cited in government briefings. The new system would apply only to owner-occupiers, not tenants, and would be recalculated each year as property values change. For many, the annual bill would be far higher than their current council tax, and unlike stamp duty, it would not be a one-off payment at purchase, but a recurring cost, year after year. The minimum payment ensures that even lower value homes contribute, but the most dramatic changes hit those in high value areas, especially in London and the South East, where property prices routinely cross the £500,000 threshold. A retired homeowner in Richmond sits at the kitchen table, pension paperwork stacked beside a letter from the Treasury. The numbers are impossible to ignore. A home bought decades ago for less than £250,000, now valued at £6 million, and a projected property tax bill of £43,000 per year. The arithmetic is stark. Pension income under £25,000 can't even cover the tax, let alone living costs. This isn't a story of luxury or excess, but of ordinary people trapped by rising house prices and a system that suddenly demands more than they have. On September 9th, 2025, a confidential Treasury briefing paper detailing the 0.5% to 0.8% levy leaked to the press. Within hours, national headlines carried the £43,000 figure, igniting fear and anger across the country. Digital petitions sprang up overnight. Within days, over 450,000 signatures flooded parliament.uk and change.org as homeowners realised the threat was real and immediate. What began as private anxiety in living rooms turned into a public outcry. Pressure mounted inside Westminster as the property tax backlash spilled into the political arena. Keir Starmer, facing unrest in traditional Labour heartlands, circulated internal memos in October 2025 warning against full-throttle support for the new levy. His advisors highlighted the risk. Pensioners in North London and the home counties, many lifelong Labour voters, could be swept up by a tax designed for a different era. Starmer's public statements grew more cautious, calling for a commission to review the impact on fixed-income retirees and questioning whether regional fairness was truly being served. Fiscal modelling from the Onward think tank, now cited in Treasury discussions, projected a dramatic shift. London councils would transfer at least £1.1 billion more each year to the national government, subsidising services in regions where most homes fall below the £500,000 threshold. In the North and Midlands, the average property is still under £220,000, meaning entire cities would escape the new tax entirely. This deepened the sense of injustice among London's asset-rich, cash-poor homeowners, who saw themselves footing the bill for the rest of the country. Policymakers pointed to Ireland's 2013 property tax as a warning. Their clustering of home prices just below tax bands distorted the market for years. UK estate agents and economists now predicted similar patterns: artificial price bunching, downward pressure on homes near the threshold, and a chilling effect on transactions above it.